Dear all, welcome to our next session. My name is Andrea Shandorova, and I'm a co-chair of this year's MIT Sloan Investment Conference. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Greg Jensen. Greg is a co-chief investment officer and the head of investment engine at the Bridgewater Associates. He is responsible for Bridgewater's investment strategies and research efforts alongside fellow co-CIOs Ray Dalio and Bob Prince. He joined Bridgewater in 1996, served as a co-CEO between 2010 to 2016, and he was named a Business Rising Star several times, according to Fortune magazine's Top 40 Under 40. Greg is involved in the charitable missions around effective altruism and the safe development and the use of AI. The discussion with Greg today will be moderated by our own Ted Keith. Ted is a partner for the Long Path Partners Funds. In his extensive investment career, Ted worked at Freebase Capital, Berkshire Partners, and also at Blackstone's M&A advisory group. At MIT Sloan, Ted is very well known for his popular course on hedge funds and long-term investing. Thank you, Greg and Ted, for joining us today, and we are very excited about your insights.
Thanks for the introduction. I guess this is the equivalent of the virtual walk-up onto a conversation, but I appreciate you making the introduction, and most importantly, Greg, appreciate you taking the time. I know it's a topic a lot of people will be interested in, talking a little bit about algorithmic decision making and sort of AI in general. So if I sort of do my job appropriately, you'll do all the talking, and I'll sort of smile into the screen. But maybe if it works as a place to start, maybe just give a bit of a background for the audience. I imagine most people know Bridgewater, but probably varying degrees of familiarity. So maybe before we actually jump into the main topic around sort of algorithmic decision making in AI, maybe just sort of setting the table a little bit of how Bridgewater works, what the research process looks like, and sort of your involvement, and then maybe we can jump into some of the more specific topics.
Yeah, great. So Bridgewater is global macro institutional investment manager, right? We manage the largest hedge fund in the world. And the philosophy, sort of back to 1980, actually, Bridgewater's been around since 1975, but back to 1980, has at its core had the following key ingredients, right? And if we can pull up slide one, and I'll describe it. But that the key ingredients to Bridgewater really since 1980 have been to deeply understand fundamental understandings of the cause and effect linkages that drive economies and markets. Secondly, to systemize those. So to have that understanding, to systemize that understanding, and then be able to build great portfolios by diversifying across a variety of different investments at any point in time based on that deep understanding. So that's what we've been trying to do for 45 years. And really over the years, what's evolved is how much of the work people need to do versus how much you can use technology and computers to do. If you go back to, let's say, 1980, and if we could go to slide 2 here, this is what Bridgewater was like. And it gives you a window into what it was like, and then how it kind of evolves forward so people have a sense of the process. So I don't know if we could get slide 2 up. Thanks. So this is the way we manage money in bonds in 1980. It's a system. It was based on Ray's thinking about, well, what drives the market? And he had from 1975 to 80 been trading interest rates and having losses and whatever. And he made the determination from now on, I'm going to make decision rules. I'm going to take everything out of my brain. I'm going to write it down in terms of formulas. And I'm going to use those to trade markets. And then I can pay my attention to what I'm getting wrong and why, and improve those formulas over time. So trying to pull the decision-making out of his brain and do that. So this was the kind of the kickstart to Bridgewater. Was if you went to Bridgewater in 1980, you'd see a whole bunch of yellow piece of paper like this for everything all the markets that we traded at the time. And people with scientific calculators would kind of put in the data of the day, run them through those formulas to determine what we would be doing every day. And if you zoom forward, right, in terms of our research process to what it is now, and sort of my passion. So 25 years ago, I show up at Bridgewater and I'm passionate about building a community of people that are trying to understand how the global financial markets work and how to complement them with the best technology to allow essentially a hive mind of understanding to build. And so if we could go to slide 3, it's just a depiction of what it's like today. But imagine taking those yellow pieces of paper, having hundreds of people working on different aspects of the global economy and markets, building up a way to store all of the algorithms that reflect all of the understanding that we've built. And this kind of visual that's on the screen here illustrates how I think about it and sort of manage everything that we're doing at Bridgewater, which is if you look at the cube in the center, there's everything that we've ever agreed to. So if we agreed that if X happens, if oil prices rise like this, then you're going to expect money to go from the people that have oil relative to the people that, from the people that don't have oil and need it to the people that have it. Now that means money is going to flow from one pocket to another pocket. And then what happens when it runs into that pocket? Where does that money end up going in the world? What does that mean about what should happen to prices as those things move, as an example? And everything that we've ever learned along those lines is translated into algorithms that we try to make both computer readable, so they actually execute the trades we need to do every day, and human readable, so that the expert that's picking up, well, what do you think is going to happen to oil? What's our projection? What are all the inputs? How does that work? What do I think that's missing? And everything of that nature is in that cube. And so now we have a technology we call our Secure Garden, where you could go find anything you want to know about the world, everything that we've ever learned about it, what it's saying about the world today, why we have the positions we have today, all systematic. And the pyramid on top reflects how we do that there's 3 things you got to manage. And is to achieve sort of that hive mind of a bunch of researchers figuring out things about the world that are then being put together into an overall system. The one is data. You have to understand the data you need for your logic, be able to acquire that data, go out, and sometimes you have to create it or get it in whatever way, but you need to manage data at scale. That's a huge issue, probably, but an issue many people are dealing with in a variety of ways. Then there's managing logic, and that's probably, I'd say, where Bridgewater has its greatest strength, which is how do you manage the logic of many different investors? How do you have people reflect logic, be able to see it in a clear way, exposed, and then manage it and use it where it's relevant and not use it where it's not relevant and learn from it? And that really comes to visualization, which is really what tools do you use to show your logic and data so that you know why everything is the way it is. And if you show it in ways that are non-intuitive, it's very hard for people to play with it, to think about what's missing and to learn. So data, logic, and visualization are the 3 things we manage. And we have people then and methodologies we've agreed to for how you deal with each of those things so that everything we learn is inputted in a consistent manner that allows this whole system to work. And if you take the circle around that, this is then what we do every day. So since we've systemized everything that I've thought about markets is being applied right now while I'm talking to you. And all I need to do is focus on what are we missing? What are we learning? So 2 sources of perceptions coming across here. There's the learning process comes from getting stuff wrong in the world and dissecting, well, we had all this logic. What did we get wrong in that logic? And things changing in the outside world that we haven't thought about before. Those 2 things create perceptions. Every week we go through perceptions, everything in the world that our teams think we might be missing in our current process. From those perceptions, we come to questions that we're going to investigate into a filter of research projects, which we then translate into kind of, well, are we learning something that we would consider timeless and universal that we would want to be part of our process? And if so, that becomes that goes into our decision-making systems and becomes industrialized. And then all of that is available and continues that circle because every day we're getting something wrong, which is leading to things to think about what we could do better. And that's that's the essence of the Bridgewater process.
Oh, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of themes there that I think will be interesting to talk about. It's an interesting, almost case study to be able to evaluate, given, call it 40 years of history. You've got a financial market that's dynamic. You've got a research process internally that's changing dynamically as well. And so the combination of the 2 presents, pretty interesting framework into how to think about evolution of markets over time. I'm curious, I guess, within that, as you think about, algorithmic decision making, which I guess is sort of at the root of sort of the base of the pyramid of everything that you do. And then I guess there's an application increasingly over time of what is led by people, for lack of a better term, versus what can be led by, however you want to define it, artificial intelligence or whatever's an ancillary process to that. How do you think about where those use cases have been the best internally within that process that you sort of outlined? And, are there areas that it's really exceeded your expectations, or are there areas where maybe you had higher hopes for what it might be capable of and it sort of proved to be less applicable?
Yeah, well, I'd start with breaking down, as you started to, the algorithmic decision making versus, let's say, AI versus
Sure.
machine learning.
Yeah.
Just to take all of those things. So as I was describing, we've believed from the beginning that we didn't want to bet on faith, that we
Right.
wanted evidence-based decision making in markets, which forced us to say, every time anybody wanted to do a trade, say, oh my gosh, it really looks like there's a bubble over here today, or whatever, to say, no, we don't do it that way. Write down your criteria for saying there's a bubble. Let's stress test if you use that criteria through time and countries, that A, it's logical, B, that you could stress test it across time and countries and see, yeah, that actually identifies the phenomenon you expect it to. And then you can make it a rule. And the great thing about making it a rule is it could apply everywhere. You don't have to be thinking about it everywhere. It actually gets applied across the world anytime those conditions come up. Now, that's all. So everything we do is algorithmic in that nature. I think you're asking now, okay, now you move from algorithms that are mostly designed by experts to what can machines do in that process, right? And certainly at the simple level, basically, if you break it down, machines are amazing at storing, like always remembering, like always being on. People forget things, et cetera. So by putting everything into algorithms, you're taking advantage of the computer's ability to remember everything you ever thought and to process data in a way that humans just are not capable of doing. And growing, like the weakness of computers all along, obviously, was understanding the reasons why. Like what actually makes sense here is the weakness. And that's where, so if you took 30 years ago, computers are doing 5% of the work. Now they're doing 50% of the work. They're doing all the remembering. They're doing all of this, showing us what we were thinking and why, what we programmed and why we're thinking what we're thinking, as long as we put it in there. And then, and now, there's this creeping ability with machine learning to do more, as long as you understand what it's capable of and what it's not capable of, right? So machine learning is wonderful if you have data that's reflective of the phenomenon you're going to experience in the data sample. And that's actually super tough in markets, right? So markets are not like that for a couple of reasons. One is that there isn't very much data. Like even if you go back, we have probably the best historic data of markets anywhere in the world. You go back to thousands of years of interest rates, hundreds of years of equity market data and such. And still it's a trap because there are a few major cycles. And while it could seem like a lot of data, it's still one roll of the dice of how the planet Earth played out when many things were possible and many things in the future are possible. And as you get to shorter term things, there's more and more data, but often it's like looking at the human body saying, wow, I'm getting a tremendous amount of data about my heart rate. And I got 100 million data points over the last week of my heart rate. But if you don't know where that data is coming from, you don't realize that you could have a heart attack tomorrow, and all of that data is nothing relative to what's possible. So that's the basic issue. Now, it can be very helpful, and we found, let's say, machine learning at the extreme to be quite helpful in finding some patterns in our transaction costs that we hadn't been able to find otherwise. We've been able to use machine learning techniques to give hints. Like, you have to be careful with what you do, but essentially we created a hint machine that looks through everything that we believe and looks for things that are inconsistent, that looks for things where it seems, at least to the machine, that it would be a lot better based on our own criteria to change the weights on different ideas that we have. And so a hint machine is another aspect. And third, basically, the other, if you layer the different reasons that machine learning are really important, there's our main goal at Bridgewater is understand the macroeconomy and how it works, and understanding machine learning as it's affecting the macroeconomy is a big deal. Certainly there's an effect on inflation rates and margins and probably regulation. All of those things are one type of concern we have because that flows into inflation and other things that we care about. Then that's the external world use. In markets, there's how we can use it in our process, which I've thrown out some of the things to essentially accelerate that circle. So when I was talking about how do you accelerate the circle? How do you get better perceptions faster? How do you make machine learning help our researchers by essentially predicting the next step they're going to take and providing them the information they're going to need to do that and provide hints along the way? And that's just the next phase that it's in, right? And over time, because mainly we're just also machine learning in a sense, like human brains are. And it's just that we have so much more data than we realize. The data that we use in financial markets and whatever is a small percentage of what we use to come up with the logic. Because we consider the human condition. We know what greed is. We know, like, there's a bunch of things that we know then to what essentially is useful in the data and what might be noise for different reasons. And really that's where we're a long way, although I do think it will eventually come, where machine learning will have enough data about the human condition and what's going on and to do that. The third thing is, the third reason it's dangerous and necessary simultaneously is that machine learning is becoming a more important part of the markets, which means the data, historic data, is less useful because all of a sudden there's a difference. Just purely machine learning in the markets has made machine learning in the markets more dangerous because it's changed. The machine learning requires that condition that the previous data is representative. If machine learning then changes the actions in the market, it changes the future data, which could easily lead to really bad decision making. And that's going to happen. In fact, that is my one of the things going on in markets today is there's more machine learning. It's based on historic data. It doesn't have data for it existing and for the things that are about to happen. And so you're going to see, and that's the last part, that we need to be on defense, which is essentially be prepared for what that means for markets. That people using machine learning is causing market action, and having processes to deal with that, to recognize that, are kind of the third part of what we're doing. So anyway, and I'd say in terms of the best use cases, it's clearly great when you have a lot of data and you know the data is representative. That's not that common a use case, but it's incredible. And some of our data cleansing, as I said, analyzing particularly for our impact of our transaction costs, is a laboratory where there's a lot of data, and there's reason that we can contain that problem to a one that machine learning can help on. So anyway, that's where we are on everything's algorithmic. The algorithms are a combination of human intelligence and computers. And every year, machines are more important in that process. I'd say it's like 50-50 now. And I can imagine, 10 years from now, we're talking about it, and the human part of that squeezed down to 10-20% of the process.
No, the framework overall is quite helpful to just understand as an outsider how, what sort of stays the same in the process, for lack of a better term, and then how it's almost applied, for lack of a better term, and how that evolves over time, and what the resource is that does that application. Now, you sort of touched on it maybe in your comment, but I'm curious, as you think about the application of machine learning relative to maybe the way you see other firms or, other market participants applying it, it might go to sort of your comment around sort of caution of, your sense of where it works well and where it might actually present risks. Is that where you would see one of the major differentiators of how you're trying to apply it versus others? Or, if you sort of tease out what's sort of different within Bridgewater on that vector?
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to say. I don't know everything everybody's doing. So I don't really want to comment on what others are doing relative to what we're doing, but I do think those are pitfalls. So common pitfalls, and I think you're seeing them in some of the market action and such, is the all through history. If you give people a better optimizer, they'll use it until it blows up. And so you don't need machine learning to know that lesson from history. And so that's the path I think we're on with machine learning, is the path we've been on with statistical techniques all the way through history, is They are useful, but not if you don't know their limits and their causes. And some proportion of market participants will use them poorly. And so that I think is definitely true. I'd say, like you're saying, the big thing for us is, while we will use machine learning to help us learn, we won't do things that we don't understand the logic of. And that might be that might hold us back to a certain degree, but it certainly focused us on within machine learning. And I think this is an area where I've looked at all the tools that are out there, and I think internally we've developed some of the best that I've seen and are so necessary, which is how much can you essentially peer into what the machine learning is doing in different ways and get back a description. A lot of times people say, oh, you can't because of this X, Y, and Z. I don't believe that any more than I believe it about people, in the sense that you can't actually see what synapses are connecting in your brain that makes you say your next sentence, but you can ask questions. You can work essentially through communication to figure out probably why somebody's doing what they're doing. Now, you never know for sure. But similarly with machine learning techniques, you can inquire in many ways what the machine learning is, why it's doing what it's doing, by changing the data. There's a series of hundreds of techniques that we utilize to then basically have any machine learning speak back to us about why it's doing that. What conditions would it do something different, et cetera. So you have to figure out ways to ask a machine learning algorithm questions so you find that out. And then you can deem whether I trust that or I don't trust that. And that process, just like we don't let people, as I said right in the beginning, we never said, okay, well, hey, he's such a good, smart expert, we'll just let him trade. That's how we do it. We say, you got to prove it. And we hold algorithms to the same standard that we hold humans to, which has meant we've had to build technology around that, about how do you essentially do enough inquisition of your machine learning techniques to pull out the reasoning such that you can get comfortable. And that's the process that we go through. And basically you can pull through, we can often take a machine learning technique and pull out of it formulas that are in the exact same language that we would utilize. And so that's the process of going back and forth between, let's say, how we represent human logic and how we get a machine learning process to describe what it's doing in a similar logic.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear the process with which you look to implement it over time. And one of the things I'm almost interested in is taking a step back from, I guess, machine learning specifically, but thinking more about like there's the layer that stays the same, the algorithmic decision making, and then there's the layer above it that evolves over time of how that's put into motion and the resources that allow it to be put into motion. I'm curious, how do you think about remaining on the leading edge of those resources? So given, obviously experimenting with it seems like it's a large part of it, but if you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, have there been other large, almost adoption curves, for lack of a better term, like a machine learning, where maybe it was X% of the resources going to Y% over time? Have there been other instances of that? And what led you to experiment with those before it was at the adoption curve to know, this is what will allow us to stay where we need to be on technological capabilities or just resource capabilities in general?
Yeah, well, we've basically, the way we've done that is we're not so much looking at it the rest of the world, but more like looking at our internal bottlenecks of our ability to reflect our understanding at scale. And so if you go back, so when I joined Bridgewater, as an example, we're in the transition between Lotus 123 and Excel, just to give you a sense, right? And it was systematic. And honestly, at the time, what we were doing in markets was cutting edge. People said you can never use systems, the world changes too much, et cetera. And like for us, we just thought the opposite, which is how do you get a disciplined decision-making where you understand what's going on without writing down what you believe and then figuring out how you measure what you believe. And so we just had to push through that, right? And as our understanding of the world got more and more nuanced and complex, we needed better and better technology. We had to move out of Excel. It was too slow for the number of things we're doing. And we made a mistake in that phase. We put a lot of stuff into C++. We relied a lot on coders and lost the connection between the person coming up with the idea and how the idea was reflected. And but we made a big effort to code so things would happen fast and that we could essentially get more real time about things. But the logic was more and more hidden from the people that were creating and working on the logic. And that was a huge problem, which led to what I would probably say is the two major breakthroughs that have helped us. The first was, okay, what we call light speed, but it was putting the logic back in our face. So essentially creating a coding language that simultaneously made everything that we did exist in code that was fast, that we could trade markets and run and efficient, but simultaneously make it totally available to non-coders in a way that you could work with it, transform it. You could say, if I change this, what happens? And that was a huge invention for us. And then the second thing is basically the world was making this more possible, and our need for it became higher, which if the one simple sort of thing that we say at Bridgewater is the averages are becoming more and more misleading. So whether you're talking about GDP growth or inflation or economic growth, the average number, the numbers that we generally had used from a macro perspective that were okay for our processes, for a variety of reasons based on what was happening in the world, there's huge dispersions between those averages that matter so much that we've embarked on this path to understand the world, what we call bottom to top. So we have a top-down understanding of the world and reconciling that with the decisions at the entity level, at different deciles of households, at different corporations, what their decisions are and how that's leading to growth and inflation. In order to do that, we need to harness the power of the cloud and the ability to scale a whole nother quantum, our logic and our testing. And that's what we're doing now. And without being able to do our data and our calculations of the cloud, a mission that we started early on, probably now going on 8 or 9 years ago, and built a way to utilize that so that now we can ask questions about the world, rerun the whole world, so at a time scale that's thousands of times faster than what we could do even 5 years ago, has opened up the opportunity to really understand our ideas applied at more and more micro levels. And without the cloud and the ability to handle our data and our analysis at many times the scale that we could before, you wouldn't have been able to do that. So those were big steps, and all those steps align with allowing, I think, in the future, more and more machine learning techniques on top of those techniques to learn from them and help accelerate.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like, to your point earlier on, almost it's sort of like an operations management problem of like, where are the bottlenecks, for lack of a better term, and then what have the things been over time that have increased the capacity or throughput, or however you want to think about it, of those elements. It's interesting to hear the perspective on those and how it leads to how you think about machine learning. Today, I think a thread on that I'm interested in, you sort of alluded to, I think the C++ example and the interaction with the individuals on the team. I'm curious how that adoption curve that you're seeing within machine learning influences either the talent within Bridgewater of who's the best talent to work within Bridgewater, or how you think about managing the team. What sort of the balance or evolution between those two, and how does one inform the other?
Yeah, well, certainly it keeps evolving to a certain degree, although for an extended period of time, it's still true today. We have 3 major core groups of talent working on these ideas. One is what we call our investment associates. Those people are thinking about the world and how it works and how we create that into algorithms. We have on the other side, let's say, pure tech associates who are building a platform upon which that can happen. And then we have engineering associates that are closing any gap in between. So meaning that while the idea, the perfect technology wouldn't require any like wiring or whatever, you would be able to go from just this English major over here thinking about the world to this algorithm, because we've created this great front end to move your pieces around. And we're somewhere along that spectrum. but with engineers in the middle to piece together the places where that doesn't quite work that way. And we have all along that spectrum. I mean, literally English majors, chemistry majors, et cetera, thinking about the world. We've got in the engineering part, you really need clever math, science, computer science people, but not hardcore technologists. And then you have hardcore technologists building what I think is an incredible cutting edge platform to allow for data, logic, and visualization at scale.
Interesting. And those three pools, or thinking about those separate pools, has where you've gone for that talent been the same over a period of time, or have pools evolved for where you try to identify those individuals to join the team? Curious how that sort of trended over time.
Yeah, well, I'd say we got better at it largely because we were bad at it in the beginning, not because so meaning that if you take Bridgewater, like we've had generally thought you want raw talent.
Mm-hmm.
Just get raw talent, get raw talent out of colleges, and you'll shape them into what you need. And that is great for certain things, and it creates this long platform, and we have this incredible group of investment associates as a result of that platform. But on the technology and the engineering side, that was mostly a mistake. Like we are making so many, years ago, made so many mistakes as a result of that, and have evolved to bringing in and having the right kind of person, in this case, Igor, who partners with me on building this out. And he is just so great at finding the right specialists and placing them in the right roles. And that mix of generalists and specialists works really well. But if you're going to build this incredible technological platform, you better know how to identify the right experts. And I don't, but luckily my partner in this mission is incredible at it. And as a result, we're not reinventing the wheel nearly as much as we used to.
Absolutely. Well, I want to be cognizant of time. I know we've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes left, so maybe we'll jump to some broad topics at the end. I'm sure we could talk about a lot of this for quite a while. Maybe to take a broader purview outside of even Bridgewater, you alluded to it a bit before, but I'm curious, as you think about machine learning or AI or whatever terminology makes the most sense to you, the application in financial markets broadly, or even outside of financial markets, just sort of best use cases. There's a lot that you guys have built internally that are workflow solutions or other elements that have could have applicability in other sectors. Not that is your business model, but more probably causes you to think about how other businesses will evolve as a result of this as well. Just sort of curious your high level perspective on either.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that we are in the middle of this incredible revolution that is going to affect the combination of the ability to track a tremendous amount of data and build simple and becoming more and more complex decision-making systems changes a lot. We've already brought the marginal cost of, let's say, the marginal cost of once you have code of any type, the marginal cost comes down to zero. The idea of having the marginal cost of decision-making, which is essentially what can happen with the different forms and well-made AI, that all of a sudden, most of what people get paid for is decision-making. And so everything else, the things that are people, where people aren't really making decisions, they're executing, that's already getting automated away. And automating away a lot of decision-making is the next phase. And I think that's a big deal. And within Bridgewater, there's we've been working on that all along. And I think for any decision where there's a good amount of data and that can be analyzed that way, you take away decision-making. And in so many use cases, you see as imperfect as analytical, as imperfect as these processes are, they outcompete humans on a lot of things and will continue. Mm-hmm. So that to me is happening. That creates a scale of recognizing where those types of decisions are being made, taking out those costs, building in these better decision-making gadgets. And that's, that has huge implications to winner-take-all profit margins and inflation. So if you go back to the macro economy, this matters. The people that use these things well are going to crush the people that don't. And it takes investment and it takes data. And so that is all spiraling. Of course, that's leading. Now, this is why having hundreds of years of history matters too, because that's leading to regulation. That's leading to revolution in a sense. And that you're going to get a balance of these things coming at the same time you get the reactions to those things. The reactions to the wealth divide and everything else are classic and also understandable and have happened through history. And you're likely to see patterns associated with what happens when wealth gets concentrated in these things. And that's going to be the pressures going to and fro as you move in that direction.
Taking sort of that broader perspective, whether within Bridgewater or even outside of Bridgewater, a number of the questions that have come in have related to, call it, the last 12 months, and using it as an example of the recurring, non-recurring of an element that wasn't predictable, of thinking of a pandemic and the use case of machine learning from that perspective. Whether Bridgewater specifically or just more broadly, do you think there are any sort of lessons learned that you've seen, sort of industry application wise in general, of machine learning that are teased out of this period of time, or is it more step along the process and there were no major insights, for lack of a better term, around the last 12 months that might have been different to the industry's perception 24 months ago?
Yeah, I don't know that much has changed as a result. I would say, obviously, there's both the limits that if you're using machine learning techniques and you don't have things happen that have never experienced before,
sure,
there's the likelihood that you're going to struggle with problems associated with that. So that's true, but known before. And I'd say overall, though, the basic thing is the pandemic itself has accelerated some major trends that are, one is clearly more data, more centralization of the winners, and generally those utilizing these techniques have been able to scale and do that. So there is some acceleration of those trends, and also the acceleration of the government's response to it, which if you overlay another whole area, right, that we're in what we call this new paradigm, that you go into a world where fiscal policy is more important than monetary policy, and fiscal policy is huge in a way that's not in your data unless you've studied the wartime economies of 1940 and World War I. There's nothing really comparable around the world to what's happening today. So you have to be above your data to be thinking through those issues and what they all mean. Now, there's stuff that you could learn from the world about cause-effect linkages and how that's going to work, but this accelerated the technological transition, and it accelerated this movement to fiscal policy being the main tool for the economy, and at a magnitude that really has very little historical precedent, which is a big deal for anybody using these types of techniques to predict things in the future.
Absolutely. I know we're coming up to time here, so maybe one last one, which is another sort of thread from questions that have come in, but you sort of alluded to it earlier on the technological capabilities of Bridgewater over time, and discussed Lightspeed as an example. Overall, as you think about machine learning, do you see it more as an accelerant of the other step function changes that were occurring in the organization, for lack of a better term, or do you view it as more of a step function change in and of itself? I think, like you would have described Lightspeed, I believe, is sort of a step function change, but also if that's not the characterization you would have used, obviously recharacterized. But almost just curious, in the context of impacts that have changed Bridgewater internally, where the magnitude of impact it feels like machine learning will ultimately land over time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be evolutionary. So I don't think so I think it'll be evolutionary, although to be clear, Lightspeed was too. So that these things so you start using them, they have impact there, and it's growing. Now, I think worldwide, in some way, in big data situations, it's revolutionary today in certain types of situations. So on an impact on the global economy, it's already revolutionary. On the impact literally to our process, less so. But I think a very important thing that is going to grow in importance as the techniques improve and as the way to think about applying machine learning in smaller data cases continues to grow. So I think that you'll see this, and you'll see that the evolution of that, and you'll certainly see more and more implications for the market as more players utilize these tools in different ways. So I think it's a very important technology to understand and utilize and keep track of.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, listen, really appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure audience certainly does as well, based on the number of questions that have come in. Certainly a topic people were very interested to hear your perspective on. So appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.